If you were in a nun now, I would walk out that door. I'm telling you.
Rose McKinney is almost 82 years old. She was locked up in the Tuam mother and baby home in the 50s when she was just 13 years old because she was pregnant. Very few mothers from the Tuam home have ever come forward to speak publicly. Rose wants to tell her story about how she became pregnant 3 times during her teenage years, and one by one her babies were all taken from her by the nuns. She was voiceless and powerless. Today her voice is strong, and with the help of her best friend, Councillor Joe Costello, we will hear from a living witness about the horrors this country put women and children through.
You want to know your parents? Come and live with them.
Today, Rose counts her daughter Margaret and her neighbours and friends as her family. She holds her parents responsible for handing her over to the nuns.
I was never close to my parents, one way or the other. I was more closer to my grandparents and to my sister and brother and John. I got away from an alcoholic father anyway. I am the youngest. I'm the youngest of 8.
Despite protesting and supporting others in her situation, Rose carries a heavy burden for her suffering.
I am angry, but you have to get on with life. I still have my beloved brother. Well, I was never close to my parents one way or the other. I was more closer to my grandparents than I was to my parents. Well, I still went down to John to help John on the farm as well. Go to the bog, cut the turf and everything else with him. But he's the only one I ever helped in that farm.
Rose says she's appalled that nuns were ever allowed to care for children.
Tell them they should never become nuns because they weren't fit for it. They should be thrown out in the yard, in the duck, in the scum where you belong.
Rosie was very close to her brother, who is still one of her best friends.
Me and Jimmy were very close.
Rosie has met her 3 children, one of whom she became very close to, but sadly, Jimmy died.
Well, there was a friend of mine that took Jimmy, and he grew up on the farm that he loved. But he was killed in the farm as well.
Rose has shared very little of her past life with her family.
No, and I don't intend to. Your brother John doesn't even know what I went through. No, and I'm close to him.
She has no time for the religious orders, saying they were violent to her.
They are violent. They are violent. No use in saying they weren't. They are.
Rose described the life she had as a pregnant child inside the Tuam mother and baby home.
You know, you get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, you go to bed at 10 o'clock at night. Laundry work. They used to take in laundries from different hospitals and had to do them, press them and give them back.
Despite the horrific abuse inflicted on Rose, who was only a child, she still thinks of others in her situation.
But I wasn't the only one. Every one of us went through it. If you were in a nun now, I would walk out that door. I'm telling you. And, not right, Joe?
Rose and Councillor Joe Costello, a former government minister, have been friends for years. He was one of the first politicians to speak out about the treatment of those in the so-called care of the state and religious orders. Rose confides in him.
Well, I suppose the long story, I spent a lot of my life down there in Sean McDermott Street. I lived there for many years, right beside the Magdalene convent there. And I had an aunt who was a nun. She was based in England, and when she came over to Ireland she stayed in the convent, and she would tell me about the conditions there and what was happening there and the women who were enclosed in it, and how they couldn't really take care of themselves and all of that. And also I was very much involved at prisoners' rights organisations, so I knew about the laundry being washed there for the prisons. And then when I went on the council, one of the first things I did was I put down a motion condemning the Magdalene laundries in the early 1990s. Got no support for it at all from people who accused me of attacking the nuns. But anyway, then as the years went by, I got to know Mags first, Margaret, Rosie's daughter. And naturally it was a short step to meeting Rosie after that. And then got Rosie's story from her, and also at the same time I would have been in the Dáil, and I was dealing with the redress scheme in the Dáil. Did a lot of work on that as well. I was sort of representing the Labour Party on that side of it. And of course Rosie's redress application as well, and we're still working on that at the present time. That isn't quite finished at this stage. We certainly need to atone for that. We need to deal with it. And that's something that's very much live at the present time, and we still haven't come to a conclusion. Incidentally, on Tuesday we'll be discussing the Magdalene laundry in Sean McDermott Street at our area committee. And hopefully we'll be coming up with some suggestions at that point in time. Rosie's story is unique, really, and Rosie herself is unique. She's a wonderfully strong woman, from considering what she has been through. She grew up in a farm, isolated, with absolutely no protections at all in terms of as a person. I mean, she had no help from her parents in that respect. The church, the priest came visiting, and the nuns came visiting to the home as well to take her away. And that's.
She was also pregnant very young.
She was pregnant very young. She was.
She's one of the youngest.
She would be one of the youngest, and that would have been part of the problem too. She would have been very vulnerable at that point in time, like she was barely in her teens at the time, and how that happened is another story. But she found herself in an institution at a very early age, going from one institution, from the mother and baby home, to going to the Magdalene laundry, and having no control of the situation and no sympathy or no help outside. She loved the farm. She got on tremendously with the animals. She found the animals much more conducive and much more sympathetic and helpful than she did to some of the humans. Eventually she escaped, and that's really what happened. She walked out the doors as it happened. She got out of the place with another friend of hers and came up to Dublin and created a new life in Dublin, and then got married and had other children as well then at that point in time. And right through it all, she has been absolutely fantastic, a positive approach to it. She doesn't really dwell on the past in a way that some people would. She doesn't see herself as a victim in the same way at all as some people might consider that she would. But she looks at it and gets on with life, and as she says herself, that's what it's all about, getting on with life. And she's done that all her life. And it's that attitude, I think, that has taken her through some very tough times. 3 children were taken from her, which means she was totally vulnerable. She had no control of the matter. They were taken away from her. She was very badly treated by the nuns in both places, in the mother and baby home, and particularly in the Magdalene laundry. And as I said, she was very young, she was very vulnerable. She had no help from anybody on the outside or the inside, apart from one nun who was a friend of hers and had gone to primary school with her. So it was a tough existence for a young woman with having 3 children on each occasion. She was dealt with by the mother and baby home and by the laundry. And that she, naturally enough, was anxious to get away from it all as soon as she could. But she did, and she made a very solid life for herself after it all. So it was an incredible period of her life, an incredible experience and suffering that she had to go through in her early teens, and she has come out a very fine woman now. Well, I think part of the problem was that when we got our freedom back in 1922 and after the Civil War and so on, everything reverted back to the way it had been. Almost went worse, it went backwards. There was no Ministry for Education established in the first Dáil. There was Minister for the Irish Language, but no Ministry for Education. It was almost as though it was agreed, and indeed it was in fact agreed, that the church would take responsibility. So the church played a major part in people's young lives in particular from the very beginning, and the supervision by the state was very limited. So it was almost like handing over the youth of Ireland to the church. And so many people ended up in industrial schools and reformatories, mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, because the church took that responsibility. Now, the state is equally responsible that it shouldn't have put on that responsibility on it, and equally responsible that it didn't properly supervise it. Regina Coeli was somewhat different because they never took money from the state. They always made it a stand that this was theirs and theirs alone, and that was bad, and the state shouldn't have allowed that. But the state did supervise the Magdalene laundries. The state did supervise the mother and baby homes, or they were supposed to, but they never did. They just left them entirely free to act in the way that they did, and by and large got out of control, and there was a huge amount of abuse, and particularly to people. Well, it happened in both areas. Now, I would see it most in the Dublin area, the inner city. I mean, so many young kids from the inner city, from Michigan or to school or whatever, they ended up in industrial schools down the country. But equally, people like Rosie, who was from a rural area, ended up in the Magdalene homes. This was, well, for young women who became pregnant outside of marriage, this was the norm. Well, the police were involved, but the police were involved in the wrong way. The police came along with the nuns to take her from her home and to bring her back to the Magdalene laundry on one occasion. Instead of investigating cruelty, investigating abuse and so on, that was what was happening, because
She got the blame.
she got the blame. The church and the police were seen as the authorities of the day. They were the people who people looked up to, and the poor youngster was the person that was blamed and abused. I don't know if there's never going to be a solution. We can never redo what has been done. All we can do is remember it and bring it, as much of it, out into the open as possible, make it now transparent. It was never transparent in the past, and that was the problem. It was all secretive. It was covered up. Now, at least, we're in a position to do and bring out as much as possible. Problem, of course, is, as you say, that a lot of the records were never kept properly. There's gaps in everyone. There's gaps in Rosie's records. There are times when she hasn't been. We know that she was in the mother and baby home and that she was in the Magdalene laundry, but it's not covered chronologically accurately, and there's gaps in the records. So we will never get the full picture, but certainly it's beginning to emerge, a lot of what has happened. And the good thing about it is that we're not afraid now to bring it into the open, whereas in the past, even back in the early 90s, when I raised the issue in the first motion down to the city council, probably of every any council in the country, I got a terrible doing over by the other councillors who accused me purely of being anti-nuns and attacking the religious. And I wasn't. I was actually a teacher in a Loreto college at the time. But I had...
Didn't go down well.
Went down very badly. I think it's a question now of transparency. Let's be as transparent as we can. I mean, we can make all the apologies, but the state has made apology already, but that's not going to do it. But let everybody in Ireland and the world know what went on, which was probably the worst chapter of our Irish history.
It hurts you though, doesn't it, Joe? It hurts you. I can see that. You see, people don't see this, the people and members of committees and feeling the doll, you know, you're not supposed to feel.
Well, I suppose I would know a good bit of it, perhaps closer to it over my lifetime than a lot of people. I would have seen it in my political period and my time in politics, and when I was living in the area, very much I would have seen what was happening. And only seeing the end, you know, it was coming towards an end at that time. But, you know, it was a cover-up by all levels of society, and people just wouldn't accept. But so when even as late as the early 90s, that, you know, fully grown adult political people simply rejected the obvious. You know, it's amazing. And you can imagine what it's like for a young person at the time. They were 100% on their own, totally vulnerable, no assistance whatsoever. There was no way out, absolutely not. And they just had to endure it. And it was very sad that, you know, a new country getting its freedom for the first time should have behaved in that fashion and allowed all of that to take place. You know, it reflects very badly. We're at the present 100 years on, commemorating all that had happened, and commemorated in a sort of a proud fashion that people stood up and were counted and fought for their freedom. But we enslaved so many young people, particularly girls, women, at that time. So.
For the continued suffering for all those affected by Ireland's institutional abuse, Rose has this message to those who continue to deny the truth.
I'd want to wake up and treat people with respect, not treating them like animals.
Rosie's pain continues, but it's the love of her daughter Margaret that keeps her going. And it's for the love of our own children that we continue to survive and endure the violence of our pain.
Sometimes I wish I could take my own life. But then I don't want to leave Margaret.